Can you use The Sims 4 to design your real house? I know people are constantly doing this, but should they? Today, I'm putting The Sims 4 head-to-head with professional design software to see how it holds up or where it completely falls apart. If you have ever tried to use The Sims 4 to build your real house, grab a snack and get cozy, this video's for you. Stay tuned. Hey, my name's Angora Builds and I model buildings in 3D for a living. I also stream about home design on Twitch and YouTube. Lately on this channel, we've been testing a bunch of free home design softwares against my professional software, Autodesk Revit. And while digging through some comment sections and forums for recommendations about different ones to use, I kept seeing something come up time and time again. People were using The Sims 4 to design and plan their house renovations, or rearrange their rooms, or even decide which floor plan layouts they liked best when house hunting. Honestly, I'm not that surprised. I literally also made a video renovating my real life house in The Sims 4 on this channel as well, but it did get me thinking about the wider world of build games and for how people who don't work in the design industry, a gamified tool that they already own and understand how to use makes a lot of sense. The Sims 4 build mode is intuitive, approachable, and familiar. It has massive built-in libraries, a huge custom content ecosystem, and a learning curve that doesn't feel like a lagging bore. In theory, that sounds like the dream design tool, but theory and reality are two very different things. So the real question becomes, how far can we use The Sims 4 to plan a real-life design, and where are its limits? Let's find out. So quick disclaimer before we start. I am focusing specifically on The Sims 4 in this video. I know that The Sims 3 has a different build system and differing levels of customization. That might deserve its own future analysis. But for context, I didn't really start playing The Sims 4 until I wanted to renovate my real house in it a couple of years ago. I remember pretty clearly what it was like to be dropped into the build system for the first time. And honestly, it's really well designed. The interface is clean, icon-based, and heavily visual. It does take a moment for you to figure out where everything is, but once you have those icons cemented to your memory, navigating around becomes super quick and easy. Build mode itself uses a drag and drop push-pull workflow that's activated with a single click. When I first started my house, I wasn't sure whether I should start with walls or build a foundation or platform first. The cool thing though is that neither answer is wrong. Whichever way you decide to proceed, geometry adapts really quickly and cleanly. Everything joins and adjusts in a way that is really fluid, and I rarely felt like I've had to delete and start over an entire Sims build like I have with other builds in other games or with my professional design softwares. That flexibility is huge. There are also build mechanics in Sims build mode that just feels so natural. I don't remember how I learned them. Raising an entire house after a layout is done, shift-click painting entire rooms, click dragging split floor finishes. When you select an object, the game immediately gives you the tools to manipulate it in the way that you want. That responsiveness is what makes Sims feel so malleable and intuitive. From my own experience, it only took about 1 to 2 full-size builds until I felt like I was past that initial learning curve. And once that happens, your brain stops thinking about how to build and you can focus on what to build. And that's when it becomes the most fun. That is also why I genuinely believe that most hobby builders prefer to design in The Sims, or builders and players are designing in The Sims without even realizing that they're doing design, which I think is super cool. Now, to understand where The Sims fits and where it doesn't, we need to talk about the professional design process. Even if you've never worked in design, you actually might already be following parts of this intuitively when you're building in The Sims. Generally speaking, most architecture and interiors projects move through 5 phases. 1. Pre-design. Pre-design is everything that happens before you start drawing anything. This is where you're assessing information and determining what you actually need from the design. What site are you building on? What is the neighborhood and surrounding area like? How many people are using or living in the space? What's the budget? In real life, this phase also includes a lot of really boring but critical stuff, like zoning, bylaws, and building codes. When you're working on a real site, especially for an add-on or a new build, we're also worrying about things like property lines, setbacks, utility tie-ins. For the vast majority of projects, you're actually not allowed to build to the full extent of your lot. I'm not so sure the municipal governing bodies in The Sims care about that so much. In The Sims, this phase is honestly pretty fun. Pre-design usually looks like sim creation and lot selection. It's very proactive and you have the ability to curate basically any circumstance that you want. I wish that in real life I could afford a rural lot squared off by a babbling brook. In a renovation project, pre-design also entails understanding the existing space that you're modifying. What are its dimensions? elevations, ceiling heights, where the mechanical and electrical items located. These all together generate preliminary plans to design off of called as-builts. In The Sims, this phase probably just looks like you recreating your house in the game. That said, this phase does have its limitations for real-life application. When I tried to set up my actual house in The Sims, my real life is located on a triangular-shaped corner lot with a detached garage in the back, and I wasn't able to find an in-game lot that was big enough to fit all of those things, but was also still a corner lot with roads on 3 sides. When I did this build, I had to completely forego the detached garage and just focus on the house alone. So already we're seeing where The Sims prioritizes flexibility and fun over real-life accuracy and constraints. Next up is schematic design. This is all about space planning and higher-level design concepts. At this point, you generally know how many bedrooms you need and what functions in the house you want to include. So now you can start throwing down shapes and rough room configurations. In real-world design, this phase is usually accompanied by rough sketches and bubble diagrams for space planning. It's also the phase where you start gathering inspiration. Maybe you're on Pinterest, maybe you're scrolling through Instagram, looking for ideas for kitchens, bedrooms, bathrooms, feature stairs, those kinds of things. What's really interesting to me is that when I went online looking for discussions about people learning the build mode of Sims 4, I actually couldn't really find any. Most of you already know how to play the game. But I did find a lot of forums and threads asking about how to get better at building in The Sims 4. And over again, the top advice is the same. Seek out real-world design inspiration, whether that's on Pinterest, Instagram, architecture, or interiors blogs. And this advice wasn't just about like aesthetics and finishes and decor. We're talking about entire layouts, relationships between spaces, overall building shapes. Those higher level design decisions are exactly what schematic design is about. So when you're doing that in The Sims, when you're configuring layouts and proportions and push-pulling building shapes, you're actually operating squarely within the schematic design phase, and I think that's really neat. Once your space is configured and rough layouts are established, shapes are in place, you know what room is which, that's when you move into design development. This is where things get more granular. This is when we start selecting colors and finishes. Do we want solid or shaker style cabinets? What kind of railing do we want on the stairs? What light are we gonna spec above our feature island? In real life, this is also the phase where we dig deeply into manufacturers and suppliers, looking at real life products and finishes that we intend to specify later during construction documentation. In The Sims, I think this phase largely shows up as changing out the swatches, adding objects like lighting, furniture, and artwork. Design development is the process of taking that higher level concept and molding it into your specific space, creating something that is unique to your own. But in a real life project, this phase also lays the runway for the technical drafter, hi, that's me, and the general contractor team who need clear decisions in order to execute that vision into reality. Which takes me to the 4th phase of the design process, construction documentation, or condocs. This is my wheelhouse. So I'm not actually a designer. I assist the designer with their design. I support them by turning all of their decisions that they made in the first 3 design phases into technical drawings or blueprints or specifications. This phase still involves design work, but it becomes much more technical. This is where we're thinking about wall assemblies, floor and roof envelopes, bulkhead framing details, or internal cabinet construction, like how drawers work and stuff. This is basically the phase where we determine construction methodology. And sometimes in this phase, it also means realizing that something we might have wanted in the earlier design phases just won't actually work in real life. Maybe I go to site and I take real measurements and I find out that the room we fit out is a foot smaller than we had thought, so we have to reconfigure it a bit. Naturally, you can probably already guess that The Sims 4 is definitely not conducive to this phase. I would say that The Sims 4 is far closer to a 3D modeling and visualization tool, but that still leads us to our final phase, construction. Believe it or not, people do sometimes build things off of visualization alone. As a drafter, this concept makes me super uncomfortable. I'm the type to model every nook and detail of my 40 square foot bathroom if I know that I'm going to be doing any kind of refresh. But maybe you're building and renovating your space yourself and you're going to be super hands-on the entire time. Or I have heard stories and seen plenty of examples online where clients will hand their contractor the visualization images and the contractor just rolls with it. This approach does require a huge amount of trust and confidence in who you're working with though. While it's possible, I'm still not sure sure I would recommend it. All of that is to say though that while The Sims 4 can't be used to generate blueprints, using it during construction is not completely off the table, theoretically. Now you might be thinking, wait though, construction isn't a design phase. And to that I would argue it still kind of is. Construction is a adaptive design phase because in real life, stuff happens. You open a wall and find a structural element that you didn't think you'd find there. A fixture you specified gets discontinued, or you run out of money and have to do something that we in the industry politely call value engineering. There's almost always unanticipated curveballs with any kind of project work, so while I wouldn't say that The Sims 4 definitively helps with this phase, I do think we can look at it a little more closely again once we understand its strengths and how it performs in each of the design phases overall. But quickly first, there is one more industry item I need to introduce you to. This is Autodesk Revit. This is the software I use in my line of work. I use it every single day for everything from small personal house renovation projects to massive hotels and office buildings. Autodesk Revit was developed specifically for architectural modeling, accounting for everything from the different layers in your walls and how thick the tile on your floors are. It's an incredibly tedious piece of software with a pretty hefty learning curve, but I have been using it for over 10 years now, so it is kind of like breathing to me. Autodesk Revit isn't just a 3D modeling software, it's a building information modeling tool, and that distinction matters. It tracks and compiles so much information. Everything we talked about in the first 3 design phases, all of the technical decisions made during condocs, and any of the changes made during the construction phase. Unlike The Sims, Revit isn't designed to be fun. It's designed to be accurate, but accuracy is money. The more we can plan and resolve digitally and make our mistakes or clashes before anything is actually even built, the more of the client's budget can actually go towards the cool and pretty stuff we've designed, because that is always the first thing in the budget to get axed when something goes wrong, and we want our project to be pretty. Now, let me also touch on the houses that we'll be showing today, because I've actually built quite a few real houses in The Sims now. If you've been on my channel before, you may have seen them once or twice, or like 8 times. This one here is my real life house, which I've already modeled in Revit and also recreated in The Sims for this video. Since this first one, I've recreated 2 other houses from Zillow Gone Wild. I'll note that both of these ones were approximations based on images alone. I didn't have floor plans, so I can only speak to them in the context of visual accuracy. And this one here is my own tiny house design. Yes, I know we recreated a shit ton on this channel, but for continuity's sake, it's actually the perfect little litmus test across different programs and softwares. It really shows what each home design tool can or can't do. This tiny house may look small, but it's a very complex little space, and Revit handles it just fine. So how about The Sims? So we have to talk about accessibility and the learning curve before anything else. Now, if you weren't already aware, The Sims 4 base game is free to play. It is the expansion and the kits that cost the extra money. I also would not really encourage you to support EA. Now, I've already talked about how intuitive The Sims 4 build mode is and how approachable the learning curve can be, but I do want to call out the cheats, mods, and custom content available for you if you want to elevate or enhance your building experience further. That said, I do also want to note that you have to know about these cheats, mods, and custom content in order to use them, and The Sims isn't advertising any of them to you in the game. Learning how to download custom content, for example, isn't particularly intuitive. You have to locate files online, but it's super decentralized among what I assume is hundreds of websites. Download them, do some file browser shuffling on your local PC to get everything working correctly. As for mods, I will be transparent and say I haven't downloaded any or tried any of them myself, although I have been recommended the tool mod a lot. I still haven't tried it. What I do use regularly are the build mode cheats, just for free placement of objects, access to hidden objects, overriding lot restrictions, things like that. In my real life house build in The Sims, executing them even remotely accurately was basically impossible without these cheats. So I'm really glad I knew about them in the first place, although I don't actually remember how I learned about them. I think it was probably from watching other Sims build videos where creators would casually mention that these cheats exist, which eventually prompted me to look into them further when I attempted my own builds. These extra features definitely add another layer of complexity to learning how to build in The Sims, but the key difference is that you can first learn the UI and base game build mechanics without them. They don't detract from your build experience, and once you're comfortable, then you can introduce these more advanced tools. Revit is not like that. Revit has a very high cost barrier to entry, and its learning curve is quite steep. At first glance, it doesn't actually look that intimidating. It's not wildly different from other 3D building interfaces. You've got wall, door, roof icons. You can click and drag and place components pretty easily. But because Revit is designed to emulate how things are constructed in real life, the moment you click on a wall, you're asked to pick a wall type. And once you look into that type, you'll see there's all of these properties. And once you open those properties, you can edit the wall assembly. And once you start editing the assembly, you need to define the actual construction materials. And then you realize you need to find the material editor. And then you're wondering why there's so many different materials and what they all do. And suddenly you're asking yourself why, if you want to make a simple drywall material, it's requiring you to define hatch patterns, colors, textures, and physical properties. At a quick glance, Revit is like a Russian nesting doll. One simple thing opens into another and into another. And if you don't know how to manage all of that information, your model can get inaccurate and messy very quickly. Trust me when I say that a decent portion of my job is just fixing modeling and Revit errors from my colleagues. Revit as a software is an absolute beast, but it's one of the top dogs in architecture and interior design for a reason. Once you know how to harness it to its full potential, it's insanely accurate, incredibly efficient, and it's improved overall project workflow immensely. It's developed to support the entire design process, from early pre-design through construction and even into operations and facility management, which So yes, The Sims does have a pretty big opponent here, but don't wave that white flag just yet. We're not analyzing this in the context of these professional projects handled by large-scale architecture firms. We're looking at the perspective of someone that just wants to design a small building, like a house. And in that context, there's a lot that The Sims does surprisingly well. But before we get into that, there's one more thing I want to rip The Sims apart on first. Honestly, I think this might be the most important part of the conversation, and definitely the most interesting to me once you start digging into it. I mentioned earlier how critical scale is in real projects, not just for accuracy, but for budgeting, coordination, and buildability. As soon as we get past schematic design and we're starting to specify real products, real fixtures, real clearances, approximate dimensions don't cut it anymore. And once you hit construction drawings, scale accuracy is everything. So that brings us to our big question. What the heck is The Sims scale? I think this has been debated on the internet for years. I've seen people argue that 1 square is a meter by a meter, 3 feet by 3 feet, 30 inches, 30 inches. And honestly, none of those theories really hold up once you start looking at it closely. Now, while researching for this video, I actually found a Sims calculator website that is meant to translate real world dimensions into Sim squares. And I think that might work really well when we're talking about walls and floors. But I do want to say right away, as someone who does this professionally and has tried to applied those skills in The Sims, it kind of starts falling apart when we start looking at specific objects and build components. And the reason for this is actually quite simple. Objects in The Sims were not designed for dimensional accuracy. They were designed for snapping, pathing, and game interactivity. Everything is built to behave cleanly on the grid. They're developed to animate properly and be usable for The Sims in live mode. And because of that, you will never get a Sims house to a real life scale. But we can still try. Quick disclaimer here, I will be using the imperial measurement system just because imperial is what is standard for residential home design in North America where I'm situated. So when we talk about real homes, there is a lot of standardized dimensions that we can reference, but even those standards exist within ranges and they're not necessarily absolutes. So when translating them to a rigid grid system, it kind of starts getting a little messy. When I'm building in The Sims, I always start by anchoring myself to components that I'm the most confident about dimensionally in real life, but spoiler alert, that's not a lot. Again, in the grand scheme of architectural standardization, there is a lot of variability in dimensions. There isn't a lot that is fixed. There is really only a couple of things that I'm very confident about in terms of fixed dimensions, and that is that kitchen cabinets are always 2 feet deep and 3 feet high. Dishwashers are always 2 feet wide, and stoves are always 3 feet high and 30 inches wide. With fridges, we get a lot of variability. Sometimes they are 30 inches wide, 30 inches deep. Sometimes they are only 2 feet deep. It just depends on the type of kitchen. Exterior doors are almost always 3 feet wide, but interior doors can range anywhere from, I think, 30 inches up to 36. Most residential staircases, as per building code, are about 3 feet wide at minimum, and the rise and run is about minimum 10 inches deep or to 7 inches high, 12 stairs in this run. So if we're saying that it's like a 10-inch deep run minimum divided by, so 12 feet. Another set of standardized dimensions that you see across the industry are mattress sizes. Now, The Sims doesn't really communicate if this is a double, queen, or king bed, but if we can safely assume that this is a queen bed, it's about 80 inches long and I believe about 5 feet wide. You can see though that the beds aren't quite designed to fit entirely to the full extent of the grid. I assume that's for interactivity and clearances for Sims to move around it. Single beds typically are only 75 inches deep as opposed to 80 inches long, but we have them lining up in The Sims, and they're about that full 1 grid wide as well. Bathtubs have some variability, but they are typically about 30 inches deep here and then 60 inches long. That again is kind of contrast to what's happening with our counters in the grid extents, because this is pretty close around this range here. And then showers, single square showers like this, most typically for comfortability are 3 feet by 3 feet, but they can go down as short as 32 inches by 32 inches. When you start factoring in the sizes of these components and where they start conflicting with each other in regards to grid interactivity, I think that scaling and floor plan accuracy in The Sims becomes less about nominal calculations and more about just accurate object configuration. Here's the final Sims plan overlaid with my real house plans. Just as an example here, you can see it's not a actual 1-for-1. Like it's vibes based. You have to go off of what fits in the space, how the components are actually configured together, as opposed to what size the space is, if that makes sense. Now, this is where I start questioning how well The Sims is at building and depicting real life geometry. And I do want to emphasize again that most of the time, this space that you're building is probably super conventional and it's probably fine. If you're doing a standardized layout, The Sims can get you quite far. But if you're doing anything unique or custom, maybe you live in an older character home or you're trying to do a unique space-saving tiny house, then if you're using The Sims to translate a project past schematic design, it's really important to understand its build limitations. Oftentimes when there's random bulkheads, it's usually for a reason. There's usually structural, plumbing, or ductwork hiding behind it. And when you're renovating or designing a new space, it's these specifics that need to be accounted for. If you don't acknowledge them or you don't indicate how you want to deal with them, the trades on site are just gonna go in and do whatever they want. And that's how we end up in these situations where you walk into a space and you look around and you're like, what the f were they doing? In Revit, I can modify levels, extrude geometry faces, and model things like fully custom cabinetry from scratch. That's how we can execute things like these dropped corridors in my tiny house. But in The Sims though, you're fundamentally limited to walls, floors, roofs, and platforms. Levels are set for you automatically, or you can toggle between the ceiling heights to kind of adjust that a bit. Ceilings are also auto-generated. While you have a ton of flexibility on the X and Y axes, moving things side to side, rotating and adjusting layouts, the Z axis is quite fixed and it's very controlled. I find that a lot of the weird quirks or errors in the game are related to how geometry is connecting vertically, with things like the stairs, raising platforms, split levels, placing ladders. All built geometry that is touching on a lot has to share the same foundation height, which makes something like an attached garage really difficult to depict accurately, or like this Queen Anne build where I wanted to depict the porte cochere, but I had to do it like this because the same reasons. Another big limitation in The Sims is the inability to build on half tiles for floors or walls. In this colonial style home that I built a while ago, it had these small wall build outs in the bedrooms and curved closet corners. I simply couldn't depict them accurately in the game because of this restriction. Another geometry related setback on this build was the stairs and how they related to one another between levels 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. The back extension of the house sat about 4 steps lower than the main home, and the main level ceiling heights were taller than that of the upper levels. To make this work in game, I had to compromise on ceiling heights and layout accuracy at these points here like this, instead of making them on top of one another like this. That's something I would never be comfortable doing on a real life project. Now, I do think you can get pretty creative with custom content to fill a lot of these gaps. For example, I figured out a while ago that I can force overlap certain custom closet pieces to fake a fridge bridge gable with upper cabinets. And there's honestly a really good chance that a lot of these geometry issues that I've run into in the past could have been resolved with custom content. But that actually leads me directly to my next point. Okay, generally speaking, just from base game alone, I'd give The Sims 4 customization a 3 out of 5. That said, the fact that there are basically infinite options for custom content means that realistically, you can probably do whatever you want in terms of components, finishes, decor, and furniture if you know where to look and are willing to take the time to download it all. And that's not even touching on the sheer amount of stuff that's available through official packs, expansions, and kits if you want to take the easier paid route, but please don't give EA your money. Where things start to get a little tricky though is the delineated swatch system, and I want to loop this back to the professional design phases for a second to explain why. From a schematic design perspective, figuring out the general vibe of a space, The Sims is honestly incredible. It's fast, you can bang out a rough house design in a single sitting. In my professional software, the same initial setup can take anywhere from an entire day to an entire week. That's just because every aspect of the build has to be accounted for and tracked and modeled. Wall thicknesses, assemblies, stair nosing, hardware profiles. Once you move into design development and beyond, real design becomes incredibly meticulous. Going back to The Sims, a really good example of its limitations here is in something as small but as important as cabinet hardware. A lot of the time in the game, I'll really like a cabinet's overall color and style, but it'll be locked to black pulls when I want brushed brass or nickel. Or I'll love the design of a siding texture, but the exact tone or hue that I want just doesn't exist. This is kind of in this green hue, but I'd rather it be more of an olive. These are small things, but in design development, they matter a lot. That's the space where specificity starts to define whether a concept can be translated into reality and how it's translated into reality. Now, I'm pretty sure I could find custom content to fill most of these gaps. And if I knew that I was using The Sims to seriously plan a real life project, I absolutely would. I'd either hunt down the exact custom content I'd need, or honestly, I would probably just learn how to create it all myself. But that introduces a really important question here. At what point does the time sink of sourcing, managing, and potentially creating custom content outweigh the benefit of just learning a planning software that already offers deeper, more granular customization right out of the box? Something like SketchUp. And that's really the crossroads that The Sims keeps running into throughout this whole comparison. Now, graphics are obviously subjective, so I won't spend too much time on this, but I do think there's an important point to flag. The more cartoonish animated style of The Sims graphics can be a pro or a con depending on how you're using it. But on the plus side, the graphics do add a layer of gamification to the design. They make the process feel less serious and more playful, which I believe is way more approachable for hobbyists who just want to mess around with ideas at lower stakes. And again, this works really well for schematic design planning, where the goal is to just start analyzing concepts and rough ideas into something visual and spatial. Where things get a little tricky is where we start to look closely at color and material realism. The color palettes in The Sims are, by default, very bright and very saturated. And this isn't just finishes, it applies to everything. The grass, the trees, the sky, the entourage and buildings and neighborhoods. The entire world is very animated and high contrast. I really wanted to highlight this because realistic finishes are not like that, especially when we start working with neutrals and organics. The Sims graphics, almost by default, encourage bold and playful design choices. Anything more muted or subtle runs the risk of feeling cold, flat, or even stale when placed in contrast with the surrounding world. Even when you are working with neutrals and organics in The Sims, you usually need a lot more contrast between colors for it to read well on screen. The Sims, for this reason, just isn't really great at handling subtle tone variation. And real-life design is like all subtleties. There's a reason there's entire articles written about how to pick the correct white paint for your house. Undertones, lighting temperature, access to natural light, all of this dramatically impacts how you feel in a space. Schematic design might nail the bigger picture. You know at this stage that you want a white wall, but design development is where we fine-tune these specifics. That's where we're looking at physical swatches, testing samples in different lighting conditions, and making micro adjustments that would absolutely matter in the real world. Maybe even only subconsciously though. This is something I ran into personally when I tried to renovate my real life house in The Sims. I had actually already previously rendered the real life plans in Twinmotion before, so I tried to just copy and paste it over. But I actually gave up on following that original plan just within The Sims because I hated how what I had picked looked in the game. My original kitchen design was a lot more neutral, off whites and greens, but in the game they just read as boring and plain. So I surrendered to a more exaggerated and expressive palette instead, just simply because it read better in the game's visual language. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of this. It's not a flaw, it's just a difference in intent. However, this is something that hobby designers should be mindful of when translating the Sims build into a real-world space. The visuals that feel right in the game might not map into reality without some kind of calibration in the process, or might not even map cleanly into reality at all. But I think as long as we're aware of that distinction and that difference, then we'll know where to make those tweaks and where to be mindful of it. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. So after all of this, after talking about graphics, realism, and comparing The Sims to professional design software, I think this is where I land. The Sims is a phenomenal schematic design tool, and honestly, I think it's one of the most accessible ones out there. When you strip away the idea that The Sims is not to be accurate at a construction level, and you stop expecting it to behave like a CAD or drafting software, it becomes clear what it's actually good at. It's amazing for testing spatial relationships, circulation, proportions, and overall layout logic in a way that feels intuitive, fast, and low pressure. Also, like live mode, being able to see how the Sims interact with it, I think is like actually still an invaluable tool to have. You're not fighting with the software, you're not buried in tutorials, you're just designing. And I can give you a real, very personal example of that actually working. When I was trying to decide on the layout for my real master bedroom, I really wanted to rotate my bed on this back wall, but we had this closet here that made it impossible. There wasn't enough clearance. So when I rebuilt my room in The Sims, when I built the rest of my house, within maybe minutes, I had tossed down walls in a few different ways and pushed and pulled some stuff around and landed on this idea to demo the closet here entirely and do a linear built-in closet system all along this wall by the door. That decision probably would have taken me much longer in professional design software, where pushing and pulling things around requires a lot more intention and there's a lot more impacts. And that's really the magic of The Sims. It removes the friction that usually exists at the beginning of the design process, because most people already know how to use it, you're past the learning curve, you're not thinking about how to model, you're thinking about what you want a space to feel like. And that's why we see so many hobby builders gravitating towards games like The Sims, Inzoi, Minecraft, or even Roblox to design spaces instead of free planners or serious design tools online. Those tools might be more accurate, but they're not as approachable and they're not as fun. And design is better when it's fun. Now, does this mean that you should use The Sims for design development? Likely not. Does it replace construction drawings? Absolutely not. Once you start caring about real materials and tolerances and actual buildable dimensions, The Sims kind of falls apart, but that's okay. That was never its job. Its job is to help you answer the big questions first. Does this layout make sense? Do these spaces feel right together? How do I actually move through this room? And what feels good to live in? And for that stage of the process, I think The Sims does a pretty good job. Thank you so much for watching this video. I live stream all of these builds and reactions live on my Twitch and my YouTube channel, so if that's something you're interested in being a part of in the future, give me a follow or a subscribe there. Thank you so much again for watching. I appreciate you so much and have a good rest of your day. Bye!